My name is Artur Nowak. I'd like to introduce our guest to you. I'm sorry we are having a terrible.
Słuchajcie, mamy trochę jak w polskim kościele. Chyba dobry znak.
I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry again. We'll be discussing Ireland and the problems of Irish church. The subject focuses around the book by Derek Scully, The Best Catholics in the World. The issue is that we are often seeing ourselves in comparison to the Irish, and I think this is his quite personal story filled with emotions. I love such books because there are people who are indifferent to the church. There are persons who, there are generations which do not go away from the church because they have never been there. That happens in Ireland and in Poland. For 2 years, Derek has been living in Berlin. He's a journalist and he writes about Poland. He's got many friends in our country. He likes Poland. But before we start talking about what's going on in Ireland right now, I'd like to tell you. We'd like to give you a little bit background about what happened at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Could you tell us how did it happen that the church dominated the political Irish life so much, even more than in Poland, which to some of us seems next to impossible?
Thank you so much for coming. As you said, Artur, I'm a big fan of Poland. I've been coming here since 2001. And the first time I was here was to cover the election when Leszek Miller became Prime Minister. And at the end of the evening, I was in a bar with lots of Polish people, and we were all singing this crazy song called I Love You Like I Love Ireland. And I realized that Poland and Ireland have a lot in common. In the years since, I think I've realized that we in Ireland were not the best Catholics in the world. Clearly, you Poles were. And for me to write this book is slightly a provocation, but I think we both in Ireland and Poland, we experience the best of Catholicism and the beauty of Catholicism, and there is tremendous beauty. I personally, I'm West liberal journalist, but I'm also a believer. I haven't given up on Christianity. I have my serious, serious, serious doubts about the Catholic Church as an institution, but I'm not here to make fun of religion. I'm not here to make fun of believers. If there are any here this morning, you have my full respect. So Ireland and Poland got the best and the worst, I think, of Catholicism. We placed our trust in something beautiful, and I think the institution and the people running the institution betrayed us. And that was the starting point for my book, and I realized I didn't really understand being Catholic. Being Catholic in Ireland is like being Catholic in Poland. You just are. You don't question, why are we? What is this? And in Ireland, I had to research for my book. I wanted to understand, how do we get to this point, because we used to be so different. And what I realized is that Catholicism in Ireland is actually a recent invention. We like to think that Catholicism in Ireland goes back to the 5th century with St. Patrick. You might have heard of St. Patrick's Day. In the 5th century, a Welsh shepherd came to Ireland, became Christian, and converted Ireland, and this spread across Europe. That's the starting point traditionally. But our Catholicism, a bit like in Poland, it's more to do with colonialism, it's to do with the English, it's to do with finding a national identity when we were being occupied by the English, and that really is the 19th century. And what we have today collapsing is not the old Catholicism going back centuries, but it's a very modern Catholicism that came from colonialism, it came from hunger, it came from power, it came from fighting over land, and these are battles that Poland is very familiar with. So the Catholic Church rose to huge power, just as it did in Poland, and it became a little bit too powerful. It became too interested in land, it became too obsessed with sex, it became too obsessed with controlling women, and that church, that institution is collapsing, and I would like to think that something new can be reborn from that. And those of us who haven't given up on Christianity, I think that can only be a good thing. I think there are a lot of priests and religious sisters who've done tremendous work. They've dedicated their lives to helping others and to living the gospel. But there are many people who have done the exact opposite, and I think we're witnessing the collapse of that. And I think we'd be very poor Christians if we didn't believe in death and rebirth. So Ireland and Poland are going through very similar experiences at the moment. And I can't wait to see what comes next, because something always comes next. I think we're living in Ireland in what we call a post-secular age. We're moving into, we walked out of the church. Everyone has embraced consumerism and Western liberal ideas. But now younger people are coming along and asking questions, well, what now? Is life just the next iPhone? Is there something more? Who are we really? And I think we're moving into that era. And eventually I'd say that will happen in Poland too. Sorry, a very long answer. But there are huge, huge similarities for all of our differences in Poland and in Ireland. We got the best of Catholicism, and I still think that's left something tremendously positive if we can tap into that and just clear away all of this terrible scandal, institution, and abuse of power.
I have a lot of questions. You have already inspired me to ask some. With Professor Obirek, whom you know, once we interviewed Mark McAllis, whom we asked at some point, what will happen after the church? And this woman, who I think he holds a PhD in theology, she had debates with John Paul II, who proposed that her husband should replace her, but then she reprimanded him quite strongly. So she showed that there are some values outside of the church, and that's what we saw during the pandemic, because it turned out, the COVID pandemic, it turned out that people turned towards the authority in public functions, before that reserved only to the church, that people were able to help one another without evoking this church imaginary, that they produce some kind of an alternative to the values without which some of us would think there is no life anymore. I'd like to remind you that Adam Michnik, the editor-in-chief of the major Polish daily Gazeta Wyborcza, he said that Poland without a church would be a black hole. But I'd like to ask you, what's your view on that? If you could probably expand on that. Are you so pessimistic to think that iPhone will be our next step?
I think Ireland and Poland have something unique. We both lived in centuries of oppression. We had large neighbours who took over our countries without asking us. And in Poland's case, you literally disappeared from the map. So I think Catholic and Christianity identity became one and the same with national identity. It's like two sides of one coin. In Ireland, it was very similar. And it seems impossible to separate a coin. You can't be Polish and not be Catholic. You can't be Irish and not be Catholic. Excuse me? Would you mind telling them to be quiet? Thank you. And yet it is possible. We saw there's lots of young people today who wouldn't consider themselves Catholic, and they're as Polish as anybody else. There are people coming from other countries who want to become Polish. And I think it's all about becoming mature, and it's about becoming confident. If you are confident in your Polish nationality or in your Irish nationality, I don't think anyone can rattle that. And I don't think by expanding the identity of what it means to be Polish, you somehow dilute that. And it's similar in Ireland. You mentioned Mary McAleese. Mary McAleese is one of two women presidents we had. bad. She is Catholic, and she's a believer, but she also is probably one of the most vocal critics of the Catholic Church, the institutional church in Rome. She became president for 2 terms in Ireland, so that's 14 years. But she also studied afterwards, she studied canon law. So she now criticizes the church using its own weapons. So she can attack the bishops using their own language, using their own laws, saying, you did this, you didn't do this, you broke the law here, you broke the law, that church law. So she's very unpopular in Rome. She called the Catholic Church an empire of misogyny. So this is a very outspoken woman, and she doesn't take any shit. And I think if there's a future for the Catholic Church, it is only by trusting women. Of course, the irony is there are a lot of misogynists in the church. There are a lot of misogynist homosexuals in the church. And there are a lot of very immature people in the church, in the Catholic Church. And to somehow hand them the future and say, oh yeah, you are going to save the church. I mean, this is nonsense. And Mary McAleese believes very strongly in the Gospels and also in the power of Christianity, and she refuses to allow it to be killed by these people. They don't want to hand over power to women like her, strong women, opinionated women. I mean, as far as they're concerned, they're very afraid of people who think. They're very afraid of educated people like her. But I really think the future lies in her hands. It was only about 6 years ago when I realized just how similar things were here to Ireland. I went to see the film Claire, which came out in 2018, I think, and it was such a brave film. It was such a sad film. It showed, the reality of being a priest, the reality of this bishop who was very much close to the Bishop of Gdańsk, and just the greed and the stupidity and the sadness of this film. And there's a wonderful line in the film where I think the fictional bishop says to the fictional priest, the good of the church obliges us to avoid anything that would bring misfortune on all of us. So I'll read it again. The good of the church obliges us to avoid anything that would bring misfortune to all of us. And in that film, he's basically saying, shut your mouth. Don't say anything. If you damage the church, we're all damaged. And of course, it's that attitude that is destroying the church. It's destroying the possibility of Catholic identity. It's destroying the wish for young Poles or young Irish people to even identify with this. It smells of rot, it smells of decline, it smells of mafia. And no wonder people want to believe that. And for me, the great sadness is that people think they have to walk out of this to get away from these people. And it's a final victory for these people because young people today think, if you want to believe, you have to be in the same club as those people, those bishops, those priests. And if you don't want to be with those people, you have to give up your belief. And I think that's a terrible, terrible tragedy because they don't have a monopoly. These are people who've installed themselves and they have created a church where they and belief are the same thing. Well, they aren't. And the more people who believe that, the more of us believe that there is no Santa Claus. These people are not they don't have a monopoly on Catholic faith or Catholic belief, and the sooner people like Mary McAleese and strong women like that come along, I think the better, and the hope that Catholicism has a future in Poland and in Ireland.
Well, that's true. That's all true what you have said, but these civil resources or lay resources in the church are very faint and very small. Well, the Bishop of Gdańsk, who was told to sell parishes to priests, to abuse alcohol, to disrespect people, to use vulgar language. And it's strange that Catholics who should take responsibility for their church, well, our church, they are not doing about it, but there were several dozen people who protested against him being the bishop. But he won in a way because he lived in a luxury villa worth of several million zloty. Well, where has he taken this money from? Well, if you consider how much he was drinking, he must have had a lot of savings. And sometimes journalists write about it, but nothing happens. People like Bishop Martin, who was against clericalism, who spoke against that. There are very few of them in the church. I have a feeling that these hard thinkers are promoted. When I look at Polish bishops, there are not among them there are not critics of the systems of the system. They are able to say, I'm sorry, but the paradox is that you can see the change as a result of the grassroots movement or bottom-up movement. They are in the herd. They may complain, but they say, well, the pain will give us more faith. But on the other hand, we have bishops who are organized as a trade union.
Yes, we had something very similar in Ireland. I think in Ireland, the idea was the more suffering you experience, whether it's from the English or from Catholic bishops, the holier you are, holy salvation will await you, or so the sort of suffering salvation narrative. I think it's very human that there's only ever a few brave people. Whether you look at 1989 or you look at 1980 in Gdańsk, it wasn't everyone going out on the streets in Gdańsk. Or you look at Berlin or Leipzig in 1989, it's always a small group of people. And I think that's the most interesting part about this story, is that you only have a few people who've been abused, really physically, sexually, spiritually abused by this system, and you only have a few perpetrators. And in between these two extremes, you have all of us. And it's us in the middle that decide what happens. And whether it's communism, whether it's Catholicism, whether it's fascism, it's this, you just need to either scare the majority in the middle into silence, or just give them enough to keep them quiet. And I think in Ireland and in Germany, and also in Poland, it's this small minority comes out and changes things. You mentioned Diarmuid Martin. He's the former Archbishop of Dublin. He's the only Archbishop I know of in the Catholic Church. When he was confronted with child abuse allegations and the state was standing there and saying, we want to investigate, he just took the keys to the archives. He handed them the keys and says, go and look, take whatever you want. And that was the first time, it was sort of the most anti-clerical cleric. He just said, fine, we need to solve this. And it was the best approach. In Germany and in here, it's always, oh, we're shocked, but we cannot open our files, and dragging things out longer, 10 years, 20 years. In Ireland, this has been going on for 30 years. Why does it continue for 30 years? Because most of us, ordinary people who were in those Catholic churches, who sat there, who made our first communions, we're still slightly afraid of bishops and priests. We still, somewhere in the back of our mind, think that they are different, they're holy, or they're different, they're an other, they're abusers, they're terrible. We never look at them as us. And that gives us a tremendous opportunity to, once again, do nothing. And my book, I was very gently trying to suggest to people, well, what did you see back in the 70s, 1980s? I was an altar boy, and there was an abusing priest in our parish. His house was always filled with children, and all the time I thought, that is really weird. What is this? Why every time when I go to his house just to ask a question about Sunday Mass, a child would open the door? And I was a teenager at the time, so I can say, well, I was only a teenager, but even I knew it was weird. But what about the rest of our neighborhood? What were you thinking? And it's not my job to criticize people or point the finger at older people. People were often in fear of priests. But I just wanted to gently encourage people to think, if you could talk to you in 1980, and you have this priest living next door, what would you say to that person you were back in 1980? And I think this is the key, that we don't expect the church or the state to solve this, but we look at ourselves and we ask ourselves, why did we think this was okay? Why did we choose not to see certain things? You mentioned Gdańsk. I was up in Gdańsk around the whole time of the Jankowski statue when it was pulled down. There's a lot of people in Gdańsk with a lot of questions to ask themselves. Jankowski was living a very happy life, surrounded by young men. He had world leaders coming in and out. He had Lech Wałęsa, and he has obviously done many good things as the chaplain of the Solidarity movement. But many people in Gdańsk do not want to see the problematic side of him. Perhaps, I'm not sure, but huge allegations of paedophilia and abuse. And the idea that we can expect the state or investigations or the police to solve this, legally speaking, yes, for abuse survivors, this is very important. But for my book, I'm really asking the question, what did we do? Who were we to allow that to happen? And do we want to admit that we were there and that we were also part of that story? Whether it's Gdańsk or in Dublin or here in Łódź, there are many stories, and each individual who was in Catholic Poland back then also have questions to ask themselves. Maybe we might not have power, but we handed power to people, and these people acted with impunity and not always in our interests, and also not always following the gospel.
I would like to ask you about the feelings that were stirred in the Irish society when this huge myth fell into pieces. I mean, the scandals, the abuses at Irish schools or at bursaries. I mean, violent behavior, also trafficking children or selling children. Power deprives us of any. Power is really something that becomes like a drug, but. Of course, when you get to know what happened, well, many people, I think, first were shocked, and then they needed time to embrace it because it was a sad farewell to the church, to many of them. People who didn't have these issues, who didn't feel that they were not interested in it. Are they interested in the church, in Jesus? Probably not. I'd like to ask you, well, along this trajectory, this experience of this grief, of this going away from the church, where are you, the Irish society, on this trajectory? Has everybody understood that these horrible things did take place? Were any conclusions taken from that? And another issue is whether the priests have taken some lessons from that. Because they don't have the authority that they used to have in the Irish society. Could you tell us a little bit about this mental condition of the believers and the priests?
Yes, it's a very good question. I think we're deeply traumatized people. Like in Poland, we use the word trauma today very often, too often, and we use the word colonialism often, too often. But I think Poland and Ireland are classic examples of post-colonial trauma. We have an institution, the Catholic Church, that moved in very quickly after a colonial power left and took over everything. And now that this power are collapsing, it's very difficult and very traumatic. Well, what will come next? And many people in the Catholic Church, I think, are encouraged to view themselves as children or as sheep, and the priest or the bishop is the shepherd. And that can be very worrying. Who will we do? Where will we go? It's also a line from the Gospels. Who will we be? Where will we go? And for believers, it's very troublesome. I think people will probably, in Ireland, there was a joke recently that said we'll all have to become Protestants and become more sort of self-managing, self-catering Christians, as opposed to going into the church and expecting the full service every Sunday. Interestingly, the pandemic, I think, expedited a lot of this, because suddenly the churches were closed. Suddenly people had to decide, well, am I going to watch Mass on the television or on the internet, or am I going to just read something myself? And I think a lot of people, it expedited the collapse, but perhaps it also expedited the start of something new, where people realized, oh, every Sunday, okay, it's nice to see the neighbors, but am I getting anything spiritually from it? Is this helping me? So many people in Ireland are asking those questions, but the institutional church, it expedited the decline. I mean, we now have, I think 4% of our priests are under 40, so 4%. So, I mean, biologically, the institutional church is collapsing in on itself, and the pandemic expedited that. We still have a lot of 70 and 80-year-old priests there. So there's a lot of questions about where does this go. I don't think there's been a huge amount of learning. I have an article in our newspaper on Monday because there's a film coming out in Ireland, and it will probably come here. I would recommend it. It's called Small Things Like These. It's written, it's based on a book by a woman called Claire Keegan, and it stars Cillian Murphy, who won an Oscar for Oppenheimer. So if you see ads for the film, go. And it talks about a small town in Ireland and a convent and a convent school, and a laundry, a Magdalene laundry. These were places where women, fallen women who got pregnant without being married, were hidden, were locked up, and they were to wash laundry to cleanse their sins, somehow echoing the sins, the supposed sins of Mary Magdalene, which of course is all made up. And this film is about this small town and the fear of pushing back against this system, calling out this abuse of human rights. And this is set in the 1980s. And I wrote an article for Monday's paper about this because I said, we've been talking about this in Ireland for 30 years. The last laundry in Ireland closed in 1996. 1996. I mean, in a small way, these were concentration camps. These were locking up people who did not meet an idealized version of Catholic Ireland. But we were doing it until 1996. And the only reason these laundries closed is not because people protested. It's not because people went in and freed the women. No, the laundries closed in Ireland because the washing machine came along. People didn't need to bring their laundry to be washed for free. Well, they paid, but the women who were working here were not being paid. And these women, many of them are still alive, and they're still fighting. And many people in Ireland still don't want to go there. They still don't want to accept that it was their fear, passivity, Catholic morals that forced these women into these institutions. So Ireland, 30 years on, is still battling. I'm sure in 10 or 20 years in Poland, you'll also still be battling. But I think the key question for anyone who's sitting here, and obviously you're interested in the topic if you're sitting here, is where was I in that narrative? And I often think of our Catholic past in Ireland as over here you have the perpetrators and the power of the bishops and the priests, and over here you have people who are locked up or people who are abused, and this line in between. And on this line, I always say to people, where were you in terms of power, and where were you in terms of knowledge? Did you have any power to stand up to a priest? Did you use that power? Did you have any knowledge of what was going on? Did you see anything strange and not speak up, and why not? And I think this is rather than expecting some big explanations from the state, I think it's up to each individual to say, well, if spiritual life is important to me, I need to do this work. I need to reflect on me back in the 1980s. Think about my communion. Think about going to church. Think about the time I decided no longer to go. Think, do I want a Catholic funeral? If so, why? And I think the more we become mature as Catholics, the less we have this childlike fear of priests and bishops. And I think that can only be good for Catholicism, good for Christianity, and I think Poland or an Ireland without Christianity, they'd be very poor places. And I think even if people aren't going, they are carrying on Christian values. You said in the pandemic, people have retained a lot of the good, but it's not a given. And in one generation or 2 generations' time, this essential part of who we are, this essential part of what makes Europe won't necessarily be there. So I think I'm quite impatient for the next stage of Christianity and Catholicism in Europe, in Poland and in Ireland, because I think if people grow up, accept their past, accept their part in that less than ideal past, I think there is a hope for a future.
Indeed, these questions are very interesting. I'm under the impression that this loyalty program associated with passing on the Catholic heritage via baptism and sacraments is problematic. We have a gap appearing in Poland. Fewer and fewer children are being baptized. So this is like a quenching of flow of Catholic people, like the fuel. Professor Polak wrote about the church system, and that was his view. Now, the next question, I heard your interview in which you talked about it, how Catholic upbringing for a feeling of guilt. Like young people are not encouraged to be proud, but they kind of think about the wrong things they've done, to confess. So confession is humiliating for young people. I think it's dysfunctional. It's a bad way. This dollarism, how does this shape people? A story about a cruel God who sends his son to die for people. If he's a God, what's this point of sending his son to die for people? No. How about this thinking that if I do something wrong, that makes Jesus suffer on the cross? How do you think this affected the Polish and Irish societies, perhaps that has stolen our joy of life, this negative approach to sexuality, avoiding speaking about pleasure in life, these beautiful experiences that enrich us. You said once that we haven't learned how to love ourselves. We learned how to love God and fulfill his commands, then our neighbors. The question is, are the migrants our neighbors or not? When I listen to the Polish bishops, I think they are not. Now, how about this pleasure that we can take to give to others?
I think it's about maturity, isn't it? Are we really going to let people tell us what they think we should be doing? I had a real breakthrough moment personally when I was writing the book. I was also going to therapy. I think the book and the therapy were one and the same thing. And my therapist, the poor woman, she wasn't really interested in the Catholic Church, but she'd grown up in Bavaria, so she knew a few things. And she said to Mr. Scally, really, I just have to ask you a question. What is the one commandment, the commandment that Jesus gave his apostles and all Christians? And I went through my brain a little bit. I could remember. I said, I think it was, you should love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. He summarized the 10 commandments in that. And she said, exactly, Mr. Scally. Now, what if your church did not teach you to love yourself? Well, of course, if you don't love yourself, how on earth can you love anyone else? And that is crucial. I think many of us in Ireland, and I fear also in Poland, we were not taught to love ourselves, because my mother told me, a nun once told her, self-love is no love. And somehow we created generations of self-loathing people in Ireland. It was, to love yourself was pride, and pride was a sin, and you're going to hell, and you must put everyone before yourself. To the point of self-denial. I see it in my mother and my mother's generation. And I almost think today we've perhaps gone to the other extreme. We've become a hyper-individualized society where everything revolves around me and I know best. And you mentioned confession as something damaging. Well, if you're going in and you've got some dude, who's supposedly celibate but isn't telling you that you shouldn't be masturbating or something, I mean, really? I think most people have matured and realized that. But the idea that confession is always a bad thing, I don't think for a minute that it's a bad thing. I think the Jesuits have these Jesuit exercises which are fascinating. They encourage you to reflect on your day, to reflect on how your day made you feel, how you interacted with other people, how you reacted to them. I find this tremendously helpful. I find it tremendously mature. If you go into a confessional and you want to be treated like a child, you will be treated like a child. If you want to talk to somebody and reflect on the conflicts you are feeling, or how perhaps Catholic values or Christian values might help you negotiate that, I consider it a very positive thing. Somebody said to me years ago, I think confession in Catholicism is like therapy for poor people. You know, I mean, those poor priests, all these people coming in, giving them all their problems, you know, day after day after day, and you know, but the priests did what they could, often with very little training. So I wouldn't necessarily call it a bad thing, but I do worry about where we are today. If we have inherited this sense of loathing and this very warped version of Christianity, this sexual obsession. I mean, I look at I look at Rome. I look at the Curia in Rome, and I think only a collection of repressed homosexuals could be so obsessed with homosexuality, and all of these other issues, trying to control women's bodies, trying to control. It's paranoia. It's very unhealthy, and I really have very little time for it anymore. But the sense of impunity is extraordinary. Even in Rome, even today, they still feel that everything that's going on in Europe is just nothing to do with them. And particularly in the era of Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, right until the end, all he could admit was, some terrible things happened during my time as effectively number 2 in the Vatican and number 1. I regret deeply that these things happened during that time, but right until the end, his last letter, he was unable to accept any personal responsibility. And I wrote to him once. I wrote to Ratzinger. He had written a letter to the bishops in Ireland, and he had said, with your terrible mishandling of the abuse crisis, you have done more damage to the Catholic Church in Ireland than the English did. Now, this is, you know, we always like to think the English are the source of all of our problems, you know, like some Poles and Germans. And for a German to accuse the Irish of doing more damage to the Church than the English was serious. And I wrote to him, and I said, I agree with you. I think we have damaged our Church and ourselves far more than the English did. But in your letter to the bishops in Ireland, Holy Father, I waited for you to make a contribution. You did not acknowledge any of your own failings, and his failings are huge. Lots of reports were going to Rome about abuse from Ireland, and he did nothing. And I wrote this letter to him, and I said, where's your own sense of responsibility? I didn't get a reply, but weeks later, months later, I got a very creamy, expensive-looking envelope from the Holy See, and I opened the envelope, and inside was a pack of rosary beads. So whether or not he reflected on his responsibility, in the end, it doesn't really matter. I think it's tragic and it's sad, but it's about self-responsibility. And I think, but self-responsibility also involves looking at your own, not necessarily going to confession, but reflecting. And I see a lack of reflection today because, you know, everyone's an individual. Everyone is conscious of what everyone is doing to them, but nobody wants to reflect on what they are doing to the others.
Przypomniało mi się z tym różańcem.
Yes, once you mentioned the rosary beads, I remember Jason Green's story. It's a victim of former Cardinal McCarrick. He went to Rome and met John Paul II. He said, I was abused by that guy, and John Paul II gave him a rosary. Now, I wanted to ask you about something I'm very much interested in. I'm under the impression that there's a certain interest of, in the interest of church, to say that this institution can be healed. I don't believe it, because the people who say that condoms are sinful, that homosexuals should be converted, we should pray for them, that the women should be very humble, and I don't see any signs of change. Even Pope Francis, he smiles, he listens, he talks, he wears old shoes, he lives in a small apartment and compared to his predecessors, but I don't see any will for change. So do you think the church could be changed? it's my impression that the church doesn't draw a conclusion from its own mistakes before Ireland, France, Spain, so forth. How about this institution based on pillars of covering up for pedophilia, of dark finance? And nothing has changed in Poland. The Polish priests abuse Polish children in the Polish churches, and the police doesn't do anything. Do you see anything that can be changed?
Very telling. We keep looking up to the church and expecting it to change. It's like we're disappointed children, or we've moved from disappointed children to angry teenager. And I think that's part of the problem, looking up and saying, "Mummy, why won't you stop drinking?" Or "Dad, why won't you stop hitting Mummy?" You know, it's almost very childlike. It's not about why are priests abusing children, or why are, I mean, in Poland, my God, you really have beaten us. I mean, these priests having orgies and drugs and people being, and everyone just looks on. And I say, it's less about, well, you could ask yourself, why are they doing it? Number two, you could ask yourself, why do they feel they can do it and get away with it? And number three is, why do people allow them to get away with it? And when I came out of Clare, that was the big question. It's very easy to look critically at another country and less at yourself. But my question really was, particularly with paying money for funerals, and you couldn't get buried without money being paid. And for me, I mean, this was even quite extreme. So the question, again, it's the question I keep asking in the book, is why do we allow this shit to go on? What is it? We are strong, mature citizens in every other part of our lives, but when it comes to the Catholic Church, we're going to take all this. And that's the point. They will take as much space as we give. And why are we still giving? Why are people in Poland still are they just so bored of it at this stage? But it's, I mean, that thing with the orgy and the drugs and the priests and trying to prevent the ambulance from arriving. I mean, this is serious, hardcore. And I mean, even in the film Clare, there was I think it was the bishop again, he says something like, abusing priests are oppressed people, and we must move them away to other parishes to keep them away from hurtful eyes. You know, this complete reversing the perpetrator victim. And yet they are doing as much as they can get away with. So I think you're asking the wrong question. It's not about when will they change. It's like, when will we change and stop, allowing them to do things that normal people would not. You know, you wouldn't allow a teacher or well, no, actually, if a teacher did this, it wouldn't be a problem if it's in the privacy of their own home. But when will we stop treating priests and bishops as a special category? They're also passport holders. They're Polish passport holders, and they're bound to the laws of the country. So once we stop in Ireland or in Poland viewing them as something, a special category, I think that's one stage. And once we stop looking to Rome and sort of magically thinking something magical will happen. I mean, anyone who's read Friedrich Martel's book about the Catholic Church will know. I mean, late Roman decadence is probably the best description of the Holy See at the moment. So hoping magically for change reveals more about ourselves, that we're still immature Catholics. I'd like to view myself, I'd rather spend my limited time on earth engaging with Catholic or Christian teaching, looking at it for myself, informing myself, becoming a more mature I'd like to become as mature in my faith as I like to think I am in the rest of my life, and not sit there like some abandoned child weeping at a train station, waiting for my parents to show up, the bishop or the priest, and save me. So I think it's all about maturity. I think if there's a future for Christianity in the Catholic Church in Ireland, it has to be people-led, because there are no priests. I'm waiting for that moment when the clericalism realizes clericalism is the precondition for clericalism is clerics. And how do you have clericalism without clerics? And it's happening at the moment, the aging process of priests with no priests in the future. We're going to have it in the next 10 or 20 years. So it'll be very interesting. How do they pivot away from a cleric-led faith and a cleric-led institution, and will any of us even be there when they decide to sort of share power? So it's a very interesting time, and I think we shouldn't waste our time looking to these group of aging men in Rome hoping for change. I mean, yeah, no.
No mówi się, że
Well, it's said that the church in Poland can be saved by importing priests from Africa. That's how it already happens in France. In Ireland, I think there is a college in Rome. Well, that's very interesting when there are, for example, our national days, and there will be dark skin priests telling us about our values. When I was listening to you, I thought that you are probably right, that this is this archetype of sheep still present, a humble sheep that is listening humbly to her or his shepherd, who shows the grasslands where the sheep can take food from. And I'm a critic of Christianity, to put it bluntly. Well, the church doesn't like Eve, who rebelled and who wanted to find the truth. But that shows us that this is what this is how the Catholic Church is working, and it's not the effect of the interest of a small group of priests who developed a certain doctrine, but this core about living for the God and obeying the God, it comes from Christianity. So I would like to ask you, don't you think that in a society where we say, I have to put borders, I should love myself, Christianity, with its loving all the other neighbors, tells us to forgive them. Does it stand any chance? Because we tend to trust ourselves rather than the God who will do everything for us.
I'm not sure if everyone expects a God to do everything for us. I think what we're witnessing is many lay Catholics and Christians turning to their bishops and actually challenging them and saying, are you living to the principles of the church? I mean, I would say to if there was a priest or a bishop here who was linked to abuse, I would remind them of the line, what you do to the least of my children, you do to me. And what happened in Ireland, where children being locked up in homes, being put into institutions to work, this is like some Dickensian 19th century horror, but it was continuing to the 60s and the 70s, 1970s. An institution that did this, and a state that colluded with these institutions to do this, because in Ireland, unlike Poland, we had a very close we had almost like a Catholic welfare state. Once the English retreated from Ireland 100 years ago, the Catholic Church stepped in and said, we will give you schools, we will give you hospitals, we will give you homes for older people, but we want complete power. So different to Poland, I think, a little. But of course, where you have complete power, you have complete it's zero oversight and lots of abuse. So we're dealing with a lot of that. I'm sorry, I've forgotten what your question was. What was your question?
So, well, I will repeat. Well, I'd like to. I'm just thinking that the Christianity, with its program of forgiving, loving other people, meeting their needs, can it find a place for itself in a society where people hear, well, you need to love yourself, you need to take care of yourself? Because we assume in a way that Christianity is something nice, something good, but when we take a closer look, I'm not really sure whether I'd like to live along in principles. But I'm asking about confronting the program proposed by Jesus with psychology, with the science about human beings with what you've just said. I can love other people, but I have to love myself. Why should I give everything to them?
There's a gentleman sitting here this morning who is very important to me, a very dear friend, and we've known each other for 20 years, 25 years maybe. And one of our he lives in Warsaw, he's here today, and one of our early conversations, we realized we both still went to church, for some reason very unusual for our generation. But he was telling me about Poland's past and this club of Catholic intellectuals that existed during communist times. And I still remember laughing in his face, because for us in Ireland, the idea of intellectualism and Catholicism, Catholic faith, it's like faith and reason. You just you cannot be a Catholic intellectual. So it was the first time I realized that Irish Catholicism was not really similar to Polish Catholicism, that there was a tradition here of an intelligentsia, of thinking, of trying to resolve the ideas of faith and reason. And I found that intriguing, and it's still something that interests me, that yes, you can have psychology, but there is a part of our brain that even psychology cannot reach, that's beyond reason. And those needs and those questions have always been there. And that's the part for me that faith occupies. It's scientific research keeps encroaching and coming ever closer to that. But we are still I know lots of therapists who are actually also believers, and they believe it's actually very healthy and helpful to have the possibility of both. It doesn't mean having elderly men in extraordinary robes telling you what to do, but it does involve making space regularly once a week or to reflect and to listen to ancient wisdoms. If Christianity had so little to offer, why are all these people today coming along with their apps and their meditation courses, and they're just stealing from Christianity effectively and charging us $19.99 a month? So whenever anyone says, I'm not sure if Christianity is, has anything to offer us in the future, I always say, okay, so what's your solution? What's your alternative? And that's where things get interesting, because I don't really know. Maybe I'm based in, if I was in India, I would be looking to Hinduism. If I was elsewhere, Buddhism. But even the Dalai Lama once, a priest I know, once chaired a discussion with the Dalai Lama, and it was a huge hall, much larger than this, and it was packed with people who were all sort of disappointed Catholics. And before the Dalai Lama began speaking about Buddhism, he said, I'm very delighted to see many people here, but I will say one thing I always say when I go to majority Christian countries: before you start looking for the meaning of life in Buddhism, reflect and embrace the beauty and the treasures that Christianity have given you that you may not be aware of. And I think for all of our fights over abusing priests and alcoholic bishops and so on, it's very easy to realize that we've completely lost, we've been distracted by these fools. We need to focus on what actually it's supposed to be about. And I think once we stop wasting time with these people who cannot be helped, they deserve our pity more than our anger at this stage, and actually look back on the riches that are actually there. And I would say what we're going through at the moment is like a slow motion Reformation 2.0, that we're slowly starting to realize that these intermediaries between us and our spiritual needs or our faith, they're getting in the way, and they're damaging more than they're helping. And there are many good people in there, but majority, the institution and people in power are not helping. And almost like Martin Luther 500 years ago, he said, why don't we just get rid of that? Why don't we try to focus again on the essentials? And I think once we do that, we realize that there is tremendous beauty there, and there is tremendous value to be had. And whether we like it or not, whether we want to move on from it or not, it is part of a key of what makes us Europeans. And what I would like to say, what makes us good people. I would hate to think that in the future, all that remains of Christianity in Europe is somebody with a tattoo saying, be kind. Like that seems to be what has survived. I don't really see there's a future there. But I think, a slow motion Reformation 2.0, getting back to basics, not growing up as people, stop expecting priests and bishops to somehow solve the problems that they have created with their flaws. So I still see tremendous opportunity, but it's up to us and not expecting other people to solve it for us.
Well, Well, I've started dreaming, and I imagined Bishop Jędraszewski running a meditation course, or Stanisław Gondecki, who teaches how to draw mandala. This is a beautiful perspective. But I believe that these people hold real power in the church. The system has brought them to power, and these are not people that speak about meditation or love. Not the people who'd like to leave all these fools aside and come back to the most important basics. This system promotes strong people who control politicians, who want to control the state, who want to accumulate privileges, leaving spiritual life aside. My impression is that the church currently is not taking part in any serious social debate about poverty, migrants, exclusion. They focus on abortion, and that's very sad.
The similarity between Ireland and Poland is that we have the clerics up here, we have the ordinary people like us here, and if they up there manage to activate us down here, they can squeeze politicians in the middle, and politicians end up doing what the bishops want them to do, because they'll say, we will preach against you on Sunday, you'll lose your seat. If the people down here stop doing what the people up there want, suddenly the politicians aren't afraid, and the politicians might start doing politics for the people down here and not for the people up there. So clerics in Poland and in Ireland have as much power as voters give them.
Proszę Państwa,
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Derek Scully. Thank you very much. And a round of applause, please. And now I'd like to invite all of you who'd like Derek's books to be signed by the author. I'm sure that's possible to find him somewhere. And you'll stay with us for a while, I hope. Thank you very much.
Jedzą kanapki z kawiorem.
Nadzwyczajna kasa.
Obrażanie dziennikarzy telewizji polskiej.
Chodzi o działania polityczne.
Ratowanie ofiar dla pedofilów.
Für Deutschland.
TVP Info. Włącz się na nowo.
Radość, nadzieja, życie, wyzwanie, pasja, pamięć, zaufanie, pokój, jedność. Słowa tworzą świat. Polskie Radio. Źródło wiarygodnych informacji.
Plany biznesowe powstają z marzeń. Dlatego nie ma dwóch takich samych firm. Jedni chcą działać na całym świecie. Innym cały świat mieści się w dłoni. Sukces biznesu to nie tylko jego wielkość, ale też szczęście, jakie przynosi ludziom. PKO Bank Polski.
Uwielbiam szycie w sieci. Wczoraj podszyłem się pod wnuczka, wieczorem uszyłem intrygę na apce randkowej, a dziś planuję grubymi nićmi szyte oszustwo z promocją. Tak się szyje.
Na oszustów są sposoby. Zapoznaj się z poradami ekspertów na niedajsiepodszyć.pl.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it. And how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Polskie Radio.
Jedynka.
Rodzina spółek Pelion to 12 000 osób pracujących w ponad 300 spółkach w Polsce, Szwecji, Wielkiej Brytanii i na Litwie. Jesteśmy liderem w branży ochrony zdrowia. Od 1990 roku dbamy o długość i jakość życia. Pracować z nami możesz w jednym z 7 obszarów.
Dziś Nowy Jork, jutro Londyn. Za chwilę Paryż, Warszawa, Berlin. Na całym świecie kultura pulsuje rytmem. Wystarczy tylko włączyć dwójkę. Dwójka, Polskie Radio. Jesteś na miejscu.